So, Guruji, welcome to our session in our page. It's
Thank
such a
you.
pleasure to have you. Tell us something about yourself. Like, how did you, land up there? And are you the only Indian? What about your family background? How did
Yeah,
you
my
start?
my father came to Indonesia from Sindh in back in 1930s, early 30s. He must be in his 20s that time, and then he settled down here. And so when the partition happened, he brought my mother and his mother, and my sister was born in Sindh. So they moved to Indonesia, the whole family. So practically, neither my father or any of our family went to India after partition. We all were in Indonesia. I was born here. And business families, I was following his footsteps, and I was doing business. And at one point, I was having a garment factory. And then I was dying of leukemia. That was back in 1991. And so that was a turning point. I met a Buddhist Lama in Bangalore, and he took me to Leh, Ladakh. I have written about that in detail in my books. And that was the turning point, and healing happened after that, just like that, miraculously. And then I decided, okay, let me do something else. Let me try to share what I can share. So that's how I took a U-turn from business to this.
That sounds interesting. So, but then what did you learn? Who are your gurus? What was your journey of learning
Learning, yes. From my very early childhood, I was keen on studying spiritual literature. And my father was very devoted to Ramakrishna Paramahansa and Vivekananda. So we had his pictures, and then I started reading in English when I went to India for 5 years for studies. So that was my first initial impact on my mind about the Vedantic philosophy was through Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. And then I studied a lot. But I would say that my Mool Guru is Satya Sai Baba. He was a great impact on me, and I was very much involved in the activities for many years, almost 15, 20 years. So that's how I started. But I met many gurus, and I've been influenced by a lot of them, by Chinmayananda, by Swami Chinmayananda, by a lot of gurus, including Osho, controversial one, and Mahesh Yogi of TM. So I learned a lot from all these gurus. Yeah.
So then why did you choose yoga? Because I think you are primarily you are teaching yoga there to Indians.
Yoga and meditation. Actually, we started with meditation because that's how I got healed, through meditation. Yeah. So I was propagating that. And then, of course, yoga, you cannot separate yoga from meditation. You cannot separate meditation from yoga. The big umbrella is yoga. So that's how we started giving yoga classes. And of course, our emphasis was always that yoga is not only asanas. Nowadays, yoga is identified with asanas. So from day one, from 1991, we have been emphasizing on yoga as a way of life, where you have all these branches, Raj, Bhakti, and Karma Yoga, and all are being practiced in the ashram.
So how do you teach? What do you teach in the ashram? Who are your followers?
Yeah, we have got many people now. Almost all our centers, we have got 3 main centers in Bali. In Bali itself, actually, we have got 4 centers. And then in Jakarta and the West Java, and also in Yogyakarta, where the largest Hindu temple is still there, Prambanan. So we have got quite a few centers. And before COVID, of course, I was traveling. Now this last 1 year, I am staying in Bali. But our main center actually is in Jakarta. And second one, I would say, in Bali. In Jakarta, people who are coming are from diverse walks of lives, people belonging to any faith, all are welcome. So, and of course, there are certain classes like in Bali, where majority are Hindus, we have certain classes for Vedantic philosophy and all that. But Otherwise, yoga and meditation are being offered to all people.
Okay, so in within yoga and meditation, there are a lot of things like we have transcendental, we have vipassana, we have other style of yoga, we have chakra dhyan. So,
Yeah.
what exactly is your core strength, and what do you teach? How do you teach that?
Our version of Vipassana. Our version of Vipassana, in a sense that I studied Buddhism quite, in depth, and I was also working in Japan for some time before all this happened. So there I had a chance to study more about Zen and other philosophies there. And I found out that Vipassana, as Buddha taught, was Vipassana, he used it as generic word, go within. He did not really give any fixed method. Of course, he gave method of breathing and all that. So based on that, yes, we have developed, because I also saw that the needs of the present society was also being addressed by gurus like Osho, where he's putting a lot of emphasis on catharsis, how to take out all the dirt from you. Now, if you give somebody Vipassana directly, they may develop a kind of ego, a new kind of ego, that I have reached certain state. So first of all, let go of all the dirt that is within, and then you go deeper. So we have based on my own experience, we have created something like 200, 250, 300 different techniques. But again, all these techniques, there's nothing new under the sun. All are from either yogic philosophy or Vigyan Bhairav Tantra, for instance. I feel that is the textbook for meditation with 112 techniques there. So all the techniques are there. It's just a matter of how you present it.
That is very true. But then nowadays, because we have so much of stress and all, what kind of technique do you recommend, and what what they should learn? Because my purpose of I have watched your videos, and I really felt that you could help our audience as well when it comes to de-stressing themselves because of COVID and also for a lot of other reasons. So what do you recommend, and how?
Actually, Osho was trying to elaborate upon what Jung and Freud was saying, that we need catharsis. Now, this word catharsis is very common in the field of psychology, but nobody has got the technique. Jung just says catharsis. Catharsis means when you're angry, you just throw it out, just get angry. But it's not solving the problem. It's not solving the problem. You create another problem. So we cannot follow Jung in that catharsis. What Osho did was how to throw this out without hurting anybody. So he went back to the old philosophy of certain breathing exercises, certain pranayam, like a whole variation of Kapalabhati or some other pranayam. All these are very, very powerful techniques for catharsis. So those techniques we are using, yes.
Okay, so but then how about elevating that level of consciousness within us? Tell us something, because you have developed your own technique. I would like you to describe some of your techniques to our audience so that they know what are the possibilities, though they come from our Vedic scriptures only. I mean, as you said, there's nothing new. But please give us some more idea about it.
Yeah, like first of all, one of our techniques that is a must. We give it as a must for everybody who is coming to our ashram. First of all, is to start with what we call rapid breathing. Shallow breathing, and by shallow breathing, you are taking out a lot of carbon dioxide, and you are actually detoxing your brain. And some of the doctors, neuroscientists, have done research on our techniques. In fact, one university, a Christian university, has done an in-depth research on our techniques, and they gave us their findings that all these techniques have been working with their students. So these kind of techniques, given in a small proportion, not very, in a very small proportion for 2-3 minutes are enough, but it has to be consistent. consistent from time to time, say twice a week or so. And then we allow them to take out all the stress that they have. It either with hand movements, you stretch your hand, stretch your body, or with screaming, just scream out. And for screaming for about 3-4 minutes, you feel very light after that. But all this should be guided. We always tell them that you have to learn this under guidance. Actually, they are on YouTube also, some of them. So this has to be under guidance. And then after 2-3 times doing it, they can do it on their own. And then after that, we have certain music to calm them down. After all this is over, the chaos is over. After chaos, then you calm down and we give them Yoga Nidra. So these techniques, a combination of different methods, different pranayam and all that.
So how do you, I'm sure when it comes to Indian or Hindus, they understand. But how do people of different faith, when they come to the ashram, how do you explain to them?
We try to explain to them, what is it for, This is, I think, one of the thickest book. My thickest book is on Bhagavad Gita, 1008 pages. But this is Yoga Sutra Patanjali, yeah? And here we write that this is Philsapha, that is philosophy, and perennial psychology. So when you address them, you explain to them that, look, this is not mumbo jumbo. This is a scripture for philosophy, for psychology. Then people are more acceptive. They take it and they read it. And they really, this has gone some printing. This kind of heavy reading is not easy to sell a few thousand copies. But, people have been reading and... So you must explain to them, actually, what is it? Don't just give the brand. Bhagavad Gita. Okay, Bhagavad Gita is doing what? What is it trying to tell you? It's our founding father, the founding father of this nation, Sukarno. He said Bhagavad Gita is a book of life. So, this kind of understanding has to be given, that all these scriptures that we hold so high in Hindu philosophy are basically of universal nature. They are all universal.
That is very true. That is so well said. But then in today's time, especially when youth is, always looking for a logical answer. So what logical answer would you give it to them when if I ask you that how do you measure the impact of yoga or meditation? So what are the results?
Right. I tell them, try it just for one session. Just for one session, okay? Yeah, take your blood pressure. What is your BP? And after the meditation, what is your BP?
Okay.
It's immediate, So I always tell them, look, don't believe blindly. You try it. And then if you don't like it, fine. You don't come again, And we always have this kind of open house where we give certain techniques every fortnight in all our centers. And they're free without any obligation. So if you don't like it, don't come. There's no force. And if you think the technique is working, there is a fee. But if you cannot pay it, fine, no problem, no question asked. If you cannot pay, it's all right. You can pay how much, it's all right also. So that kind of subsidy, we need to run the ashrams. Of course, we need money. So we cannot, at this moment, we cannot still give all the programs free. And also I'm against donations from certain people, so that I do not become their master's voice.
I understand what you mean, because then I'm sure Healthy and Mighty would want you to be at their back and call. So true. So then what all books have you written? Because since you have written 180, what other subjects have you covered in those books?
More books are on Vedanta philosophy, but I think we are the first ones to elaborate and to start translating the works of Adi Shankara. Before us, there have been no work of Adi Shankara translated. Bhagavad Gita, the first translator of Bhagavad Gita into Indonesian was Muslim. The second one was a Jesuit priest. So after that, then the Hindus started to translate. But until today, if you ask me, from the depth of my heart, I will say the first translation by the Muslim is actually more correct to the spirit of Gita. So Gita, Bhagavad Gita. Sorry.
I said that's really sounds interesting. I mean, if you think it is up to that mark, which is brilliant.
True.
Yeah. So what did you think? You were saying something, yeah.
Yeah, so the Adi Shankara's books, of course, we have translated like not only translation, but also the understanding, the interpretation and all that of Atma Bodh and Bhaj Govindam and some other works and parts of Srimad Bhagavatam, but not Srimad Bhagavatam, the whole thing, parts of it. And Gita, Bhagavad Gita, I consider myself a student of Gita from 1997 when my first edition of Bhagavad Gita in Indonesian appeared. Ever since, we have got 6 different editions. Editions means 6 different understanding. Like I give you an example, my understanding of Atma and Jivatma until last year was different. Most of the translation of Gita, if you see, Atma and Jivatma are considered the same. And if it is translated as soul, then it destroys the whole meaning. So now, in my latest translation of Bhagavad Gita, I try to preserve the original word Atma and try to give some understanding, but I do not try to translate again as soul or equivalent in Indonesian.
That is so true because I have interviewed such authors earlier who have started using the Sanskrit words as it is, even in their versions of Bhagavad Gita or any other scriptures they write. And I think that is the best thing to do because it's time, the way we have inserted so many Hindi words into English, it's time that originally we insert Sanskrit words as it into the dictionary because there is no equal and there is no other word in English because they just don't have that philosophy. They don't have that understanding. So it's time that it's really wonderful what you said. So then what have you discovered in Shankaracharya's philosophy? So what do you teach there?
Yeah, I was getting more interested in Shankaracharya because we have got more than 1,000 years old stone tablet where the king of Srivijaya, Sumatra, one of the islands, one of the major islands, he has commissioned that writing on the tablet. It says that I am so blessed today to receive a direct disciple of Adi Shankara. So one of the direct disciples of Adi Shankara apparently had come to Sumatra, and this is 1,000 years old tablet. And then it's also said that he wanted to have the Sri Chakra. You know, the Sri Yantra, Sri Chakra, it was lost in India. And they wanted to have it, to have a copy of that. I don't know in which form, it is not written. And we presented the Sri Yantra to him. And he brought it back to India. And then, of course, again, in my meeting with Dalai Lama, I was also, before that I knew it, but Dalai Lama emphasized upon it, that 1,200 years back, one Bengali Pandit had come to Sumatra to learn meditation. So it's vice versa, not to India, but from India, from Bengal coming to Sumatra. So that created a lot of interest in me to go deeper, although I had read Adi Shankara several times many years ago, to go deeper into the Saundarya Lahiri and other works of Adi Shankara. And then I found, yes, there is so much of similarity. But out of context, perhaps, I was just thinking, it just came to my mind, that until one of the last scriptures, Hindu scriptures written in Indonesia, the word Hindu is never used. That was 400 years ago. The word that was used was Shiva Tattva, the essence of Shiva's teachings. And for Buddha, it is written Jinna Tattva, the essence of Buddha's teaching. So until 400, 500 years ago, there was no such thing as Hindu. But the word Sanatan is used in Java. In the West Javanese dialect, that is Sundanese dialect, it's called Vivitan. The meaning is exactly same, Sanatan. And there are followers of Vivitan to this date. There are thousands of people, maybe altogether there could be 10 to 15,000 people who believe that they follow this from their ancestors.
That is very interesting. So, how many islands are there, and how many Hindus are there? What are their general practice? Because I would like you to give a picture about the Hindu culture of Indonesia to our audience.
We have got 17,000 islands. 17,000 islands. 17,000, perhaps not more than 4,000 are even named. So many are not even named. Out of 4,000 islands, the majority of population live in 2 islands. So we are quite not very densely populated. These 2 islands, yes, very densely populated. With 270 million people in the whole country. The number of Hindus, not more than 10 million. They come from that age now. They still have animal sacrifices. In Bali especially. In Java, no. In Java, the offering is purely, most of the time it is flowers and fruits. Sometimes, yes, animal, but in Bali there is still animal sacrifices. And the festivals are different. We have equivalent of Diwali, but we don't have Deepavali, we don't have Holi, we don't have Dashera. So all these Puranic gods are not there. What we have is Galungan, like we are having Galungan, that is something like Shrad, when we believe that the ancestors are coming down and we have to give them food and all that. And then we slaughter a pig, a boar, a wild boar. So all these different practices, if you see Vedas and you try to take it literally, okay? Not the philosophic part of Veda, but take it literally, then all this you got to see here. All these yajnas where the animal sacrifices are made, and so they have different varieties. In Java, the temples are built in a very different way than in Bali. Although the distance is only 1.5 hour by flight, but still the temples are totally different architecture.
That is very interesting. So I think maybe they have got that old influence of Vedic culture.
True.
It was pre maybe all these gods who we worship in India now. Because I think now I think in Indian society we pray more to Shiva and Krishna and Ram or Shiva's family.
Trimurti is popular here. Trimurti, Brahma, Shiva is popular, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. Ganesha is popular. And of all the Devis, Saraswati is very popular, more popular than Lakshmi. And we have a different version of Lakshmi. We call her Devi Sri, with a paddy in her hand. Because agricultural society, so she doesn't have guineas and coins, but she has a paddy. Different ways of depicting God based on their culture, their norms in society.
That is very interesting, because you said they're indigenous Hindus. So that means they have their own practices, but they are very much called Ved. So what do they call themselves? Because Hindu word, as you correctly said, so what do they call themselves?
And this is interesting. The Javanese will call themselves Kajavan. We are people of Java. We follow the norms of Javanese society. The people in Bali call themselves Balian. Before Hindu word became popular and was accepted in 1950s. Only 1950s, very recently. Before that, the Balinese were calling themselves Balian. We follow the Bali tradition. We follow Tirtha. We follow the holy water. And holy water has a very special place for them. And in Java, it's the norms of Javanese culture until today. They call themselves followers of Kajavan. It is just like Hindus in India calling themselves Indian. What is Indian? Indian means Hindu. You can be following any religion. You are Hindu. Coming from Indus, all the countries beyond Indus are all Hindus.
Yeah, that was supposed to be the the explanation of Hindus, but then it got converted into a religious and dharmic aspect of people's belief. And then, so that's how we got divided as followers of different religions within India. So that we understand, but then how do they, like, for example, what kind of rituals they follow? Are they same as Vedic yagna? Because I'm sure they also must be having their, way of doing yagna. How do they perform wedding rituals?
Very similar. There are a lot of similarities. With, for instance, in Sumatra, you find a lot of similarities with the practices in Bengal, Orissa. And some of the practices are even very similar to Punjab, that part of India. And then when they use this Ganta, the Ganta design is very similar to Tibet with the Vajra style and all that. So we have amalgam of so many different things here. And of course, now the majority of Indonesians are Muslims. So 80+% are Muslims. We are the Muslim majority country, but we are not Muslim country. The motto of Indonesia's republic is belief in one God. So you can believe in any form of God. As long as you believe in God, you are protected by society. That is the motto, okay? What is happening is a different story. But that's the motto. But that's very good motto. And so some people who are still practicing these kind of rituals, which are very much derived from Vedas or from their own scriptures, because we have got our own scriptures here. 7 of them were translated by one Jansangi who came to Indonesia in 1950s, and my father was interpreting for him, Professor Raghuveer, whose son, Lokesh Chandra, was the president of ICCR until last year or so. So they came down here and they found these scriptures. These scriptures are written in Balinese script or Javanese script, but the language is very close to Sanskrit. So that is also another thing that we have to understand, that Sanskrit as a language may have been there for a quite long time, but Devanagari script, what we call Devanagari now, how Sanskrit is written, came much later. There should be some other scripts there, Brahmi script or so, because most of the scripts here, the ancient scripts, are very close to Pallavi, to Pali, not to Devanagari. So Devanagari could be a very recent development, few thousand years old, not more than 2 in my opinion. And before that, Sanskrit was spoken language, written in different scripts, Brahmi and other scripts.
I was about to ask you that what language you have and whether it is influenced by Sanskrit or not.
Oh, yes.
It is.
Yeah,
it is.
It is very much influenced by Sanskrit, by Prakrit languages, not only by Sanskrit, but by Prakrit languages. Vakratunda Mahakaya, Tunda, Vakratunda is the trunk, right? What do you call it? Not the trunk. What do you call this? I don't know. Are you from Gujarat originally?
Yeah.
Is there any word Sund in Gujarat?
Yeah. We, that's what I said. It is Sund.
Yeah, Sund. So we have got Sunda, from Sund to Sunda. I think 50 or 60% of the words are from either Prakrit or Sanskrit. And Sanskrit came later. So Prakrit languages, which includes Gujarati, Punjabi, Sindhi, Marathi, Awadhi, and all these languages together are Prakrit languages.
Yes, we have lots of influence in our language from there. So you mentioned about scriptures. So what scriptures are you talking about, which are written in Burmese?
We have different scriptures. Let me show you some. We have different scriptures. Like I'll show you 3 of them. Can you read this? Yeah, I have retranslated. This is Vritti Shasan, Tattva Sanghyang, Mahagyan. And then we have got Sara Samuchaya. These are in 3 volumes, big volumes these are. Sara Samuchaya, Shlokantara, Sevak Dharma. So all these words are Sanskrit or Prakrit languages, but they are written in the local language, in Javanese. So we have retranslated what I was studying about Professor Raghuveer, because he translated some of them into Hindi and some in English, but very old English, 1950s English. So we have done retranslation of all these scriptures into English and Indonesian. So it's trilingual actually, with the original text, and trying to revive all these scriptures.
That is very interesting. So do you have this influence of English language on the island so much like India, the way we are suffering?
No, not so
Indonesia,
much.
No? Was Indonesia colonized by British ever?
No, British, yes, for some part of it, but for very short period. But we are colonized by the Dutch.
Dutch, okay.
Yeah, so yes, there is influence, of course, of the Dutch language or English, but it's not so much as Sanskrit and Arabic, of course. When the Arab traders came here and 500 years back, people started to convert, then the Arabic words came in.
Okay, so in your mainstream language, you mean that they got into your main language?
Yeah.
Okay. So you forgot to answer that. What are your wedding rituals?
Oh, yes.
When it is a Hindu wedding, how close it is to our Hindu wedding of India?
Yeah. Okay. Now the essence could be same. Like so many days. I had some idea of Sindhi and Punjabi wedding, but I think Gujarati are very close to Sindh also. So like few days before wedding, you have certain pujas and certain ceremonies, both on the girl's side, the bride's side, and the bridegroom. These are there. So after wedding, also there are some ceremonies like when the bridegroom comes to the bride comes to the house, and she has to put her foot on nariyal, right, on coconut. Here they put it on egg. She's supposed to break the egg. Basically, the essence could be the same, but the outer form are different.
It's a connection,
so the outer form could be different, but the essence is same. These are among people who are still following the original, what they call the original kepercayaan, the original faith of indigenous people. Although they don't call it Hindu, but they are all Sanatani.
Okay, so that sounds very interesting. You also mentioned about animal sacrifices. So, is there any way you can stop it, or is there any kind of people who are trying to stop it? Because this was a very old practice, and in India, lots of people have already outgrown it. They have understood that animal sacrifice is not the answer to a lot of problems. So what is the view about others about, this particular thing?
I would like not to speak about this.
I understand.
Because let me tell you that recently there was a group like Hare Krishna movement. It's a huge movement, But when they started doing this, people got annoyed.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because vegetarianism is the core of Hindu or Vedic culture. And I personally stand for it. I promote that in Kenya, and I've done hundreds of such seminars and book distributions and spoken to so many students to give up, meat. Because I live in a continent which is a highly meat-eating continent, it's not that easy. But then they understand and appreciate, because they know that it is not healthy at the same time. And
people who come to ashrams, not only our ashram, but a lot of other ashrams also, ultimately they become vegetarian. Although we don't force them, we don't tell them. But when they see that this is more healthy and it makes more sense, and then they become vegetarian on their own. So that is a plus point. That is a good, promising thing to happen. But otherwise, yes, mainstream Hindus, they are still meat eaters, and there is animal sacrifice.
Okay, so we have other system of caste, this in the society. Do you practice that in Indonesia as well?
Sorry, other system of what did you?
We have this caste system.
Yes.
I feel particularly I feel it is a great system, but what do you think about it?
Yeah, I would say the same thing that everybody is saying. We didn't have any caste system until the British came.
Right.
So what we had was Varnashram, and Varnashram is totally different story. It's based on profession. And if you see most of the Vedic rishis, those who got the revelations of Vedas, of mantras, they were all Kshatriyas. They were not even Brahmanas. Vishwamitra was Kshatriya, and all our avatars are not Brahmins. Avatars are Kshatriya. And Vyas, who is considered as Jagat Guru, I was writing on him, Jagat Guru. He was a son born out of wedlock, but we still respect him as Jagat Guru for his what he did, not because of his birth. So we didn't have all this kind of thing. But here somehow the system is there.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons that a lot of things are happening. But again, these kind of things we cannot speak in public.
I'm sure. Yes. The idea is, the reason I'm asking you is I want people to understand that originally what it was and how we have got perverted on the name of caste discrimination, caste system, caste issues, intercaste marriages, and lower and upper, that category, which was a direct gift of British to us. Because earlier, Brahmins were never rich. So I have never understood how come they became the oppressing one. How come they became the head? Because they were never rich. Kshatriyas never had full knowledge of scriptures. They knew some, but they were mostly warriors and the kings. But they were dependent on the Vaishyas, as in the business community, because the money was preserved by them, and the whole society was run by the Shudra, who were supposed to work with their hands. So there was actually no one particular community had full power of the society.
Yes.
So this was such a wonderful way of keeping and running a world, actually, not society or not only India, but the world for centuries and for millions of years.
Yeah.
So I understand, but it's not happening currently.
We have been writing a lot. We have been writing a lot. I am contributing to some journals also, and in my books also we have been writing. And in fact, this whole thing is more of a political thing now with Dalit. And Dalit, what is Dalit? Dalit is oppressed. Now, someone who is oppressed is Dalit. He can be Brahman, he can be Vaishya. If he's oppressed, if some atrocities or something is inflicted upon them, they are Dalit. Everybody can become a Dalit. Dalit is not a particular community, So we have been writing on this, and we have been trying to give some understanding. It has been slow, but we don't stop. We keep on doing this.
That's wonderful. So one of the things which you mentioned is in other philosophy, like you have written more than Bhagavad Gita and Shankaracharya's philosophy. So what more have you touched upon in your books? Because you have 180 books.
Meditation from very different angles. Meditation from Sufi angles. I think I've written more than 10 or 12 books on Sufi tradition, meditation in Sufi tradition. Especially those Sufis who are not known so much in Indonesia, like the Sufis from Sindh, who are, I would say they are Vedanti Sufis, or somebody from Punjab like Farid Baba, and so many Bhaktas there from other places also. So those books, and again, from other tradition, from the Chinese tradition, from the Buddhist tradition, from the tradition of Lao Tzu, from Zhuangzi, and from other tradition as well. Yeah, Kundalini on many subjects.
That's interesting. So, as you said, you usually teach people who come to the ashram. But what about, what do you see in the society? As in, are they spirituality oriented, they are bhakti oriented, or they are Vedic rituals oriented?
In Bali, they are more ritual oriented, but now, of course, there's a mix, quite it's an amalgam society, and there are people who are more interested in Gyan. So, of course, they are into studies and all that. But the thing is, we have to somehow bring them together. What is happening now, those who are into Gyan, they say, okay, all these ritualistic people, whatever they want to do, let them do, fine. But they have to come together. They have to come together. We have to bring them together, and we have to tell them, look, it is not about jnana alone or ritual alone. Everything must come together. Krishna says, I am those bhaktas who are devoted to me, and those who are doing my work, those who are engaged in karma yoga. They I love. So Krishna is giving us a wholesale yoga. You cannot separate jnana from other practice, from bhakti and other practice. And bhakti is not only bhajan and kirtan, but it's a way of doing things fully devoted, fully dedicated. In fact, I have even written bhakti for total success, how to achieve total success in your life. As a businessman, I have some experience when I was running my own business and all that. So I've been sharing those things also, how the philosophy of Gita can be applied in day-to-day life.
That is very interesting. I realize that you're talking about studying scriptures. Do you have Hindu universities? What is the education type? Because in India, we are struggling to have our scriptures as educational material and having scriptures in the universities. So what is the scenario over there?
I think we have got about 13 Hindu universities all over Indonesia. Majority of them are in Bali, of course. And then we have got one in Jakarta, one somewhere in the islands, where the Hindus are there. Now, these Hindu universities are, yes, into Hinduism. They are teaching about Hinduism, but they are also teaching other subjects. But because this whole education system is currently decided by the central policy, so we cannot really make some changes, outright changes. But when it is Hindu university, then yes, we have the freedom to teach them anything that is concerning Hinduism.
Like what do they teach? What are the current subjects?
For instance, we have a Hindu university here with a faculty on Brahma Vidya. That is the equivalent of theology, because other religions, they got theology. So the Hindu university, they decided to have a faculty and call it Brahma Vidya. And there they have all Upanishads are being studied and other scriptures are being studied.
That is good. So do you, how is your curriculum? Because in your mainstream curriculum, do you have influence of Hindu religion or no? Or
as a history, that once upon a time, this country had Hindu kings and all that as history, but not the values. Maybe the values which are still prevailing in the society, but not so much directly, no.
Not directly. Okay, so you don't have Ramayana, Mahabharata or any scriptures directly being taught in the school?
We used to have. Our first president, he said, Ramayana and Mahabharata is not religious scriptures for us. It is our cultural scriptures. So even though I'm a Muslim, we still have Ramayana. And we have statues of Krishna on the main street in Jakarta. Krishna and Arjuna. We have got Taman Mini Indonesia. There is the miniature Indonesia, a huge park where all the different islands are depicted. And there the mascot is Hanuman. So all those things are into our veins, into the mainstream. Before Amar Chitrakatha came, we had comics on Ramayana and Mahabharata in volumes. 40, 50 volumes of Mahabharata comic.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand whether you have, you have this kind of system from where we can, our generation can learn about our scriptures, or in whatever ways. I mean, even this cartoon series you mentioned, it's a wonderful way of teaching the kids.
Sure.
And introducing them characters, because I personally would want that Arjun or Hanumanji or we want superheroes from there, because they come with lots of values. There are lots of, in the whole, their character, in Arjun's character or Hanumanji's character, and there are so many such characters. They come with so much of dedication, sacrifice, values, and so much of humility. So I really feel that they should be our heroes. But anyway, I wish that that will be the future, that they become part of our mainstream education, and they become our mainstream heroes, and
It used to be. It used to be until 1960s, 70s, early 70s.
In Indonesia.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, right.
Well, we have our own school now. We have our own school from standard 1, right from playgroup actually to high school. And there, of course, we have the ability to have some extracurricular activities because we are not funded by any agency. We are not funded by government. So we can decide on our own. And that's how we want it to be, wanted to remain as such. And there, yes, we are trying to give them these values. But again, when we are talking about Hindu as a value system outside in India, we have to concentrate on Hindu as civilization, Hindu as a cultural force, which unites the whole region from Iran to outer parts of Australia. Now, if you see this as a cultural or civilizational thing, then you have no argument. But if we emphasize on Hindu as Hinduism, then we have problem.
Yeah, that problem is being faced by a lot of people, and that's a challenge. It's time to change the perception, and it's time to let the world know that it is more of a way of life, and the culture and the values, and that is the core essence. But I think maybe we have to change as per the challenges we are facing. I can't say time. We had to evolve ourselves as per the challenge. Earlier times, 1,000 years back, temples were the centers.
Yes.
Temples were the centers, and then a lot of bhakti movement came wherein people started worshipping Krishna at home. That was required to do. So we have this history of Tamilians conquering that part of the world. So do you have that influence still? Because
it's a black dot on our history. It's a black dot on our history.
Why black dot?
That happened 1,000 years back. Okay, just 1,000 years. The Chola dynasty. And he took one of the kings from Srivijaya, who was a Hindu, and his cousin. Both were Varman. Until now, we have got the surname Varman in Indonesia. They are Muslims, but they still maintain that surname. Okay? Some family feud, family dispute, and he caught hold of this king, and they took him to India, and they slaughtered him, cut his head to teach a lesson, From that day onwards, we didn't have, Indonesia, Srivijaya didn't have any army to defend themselves. They didn't have any army. They were mostly concentrating on trade because spices. They could trade with anybody, and they were selling spices up to Madagascar and all that. So they were concentrating on business, not on defense. They didn't have any defense problem. But once they were attacked by Chola dynasty, then they started to have their defense problem. And they came out from the family fold of the Chola dynasty. And some other invaders, they came and they started joining hands because they needed some support. They needed some defense. So from our perspective, that was the blunder made by the Chola dynasty to attack and to allow them to look for defense elsewhere. Otherwise...
That is very different point of view. I'm hearing for the first time.
The history would be different.
Glorified. It's generally glorified that they ruled till there, from south till far.
This day, I keep reminding my Tamil friends that if you speak like that, go back to Malaysia. There's what we call Bujang Valley there. They have found a Ganesha statue, Pratima, that is 2,300 years old, still intact.
Wow.
Okay? This Chola is just 1,000. Hindus were already there. Whether they were calling themselves Hindus or no, forget Hinduism. Hinduism is new.
True.
Worshippers of Ganesha is what? Sanatani, worshippers of Mahishasura-Mardini. We have a temple dedicated to Mahishasura-Mardini. 1,000 years old. Before Chola was nothing. Chola created such a blunder that we are suffering to this date.
Oh, is it? I mean, this is something new. I'm sure my audience also wouldn't have thought in that point of view that what would be the impact on the country where they went and ruled. And I'm really surprised. So my last question to you
Yeah.
is, we see a lot of misconception about Bali and
Yeah.
Indonesia,
Mhm.
more because it is more of a touristic country, and
Yeah.
it's more they consider that to be very modern and all. How is the impact of modern world on youth of Indonesia? I mean, are they getting too westernized, or do they understand and appreciate their heritage? What are the challenges for you?
The challenges presently is to make them understand what Sanatan Dharma is all about. Let the rituals be there. Okay, we do not even discuss rituals. Okay, whatever rituals they want to do, fine. Whatever rituals I want to do, fine. I should be allowed to do rituals in my own way, and they can do in their own way. It's a freedom. Okay, fine. But when we come to the essence of Sanatan Dharma, it's one, and that binds us. Whether you talk from Gita or you talk from these scriptures, local scriptures, they are all talking about the same thing. Okay, differences here and there. For instance, let me tell you one thing very interesting. In the Yama and Niyama of the yogic scriptures there, we have got different set of Yama and Niyama. We have got one particular tenet that is avyavaharik. You should not be commercial. You should not be commercializing your knowledge. So we have different sets, but the essence is same. The essence is same. Now, how to make our youth understand this is the greatest challenge, that we inherit such a beautiful thing which has the answers to all the problems faced by the world today. We are not trying to convert people. Let them follow their own religion, fine. Let them do their own rituals, fine. But we, as the inheritors of such a great civilization and culture, we should preserve all these things, and we should not only preserve, not to build a museum around that, but to practice all these values. So this is the greatest challenge.
But then I've heard that the Vedic rituals which are followed there are very expensive somehow in Indonesia.
Yeah.
And that is the reason why people are going away from it. So is there any way, what is a way out? I mean, you will have to tell me that what is a way out?
The way out is you come here. You come here and let's talk. maybe I'm serious. I'm serious. We can try to organize meetings in the universities and all that, and let there be people coming here and give them ideas, give us ideas. I consider myself as part of this society, and if there are some ills in the society, then I'm open enough to hear some ideas. So let's have a meeting, not huge conferences. Conferences, we have had enough conferences. It's not helping at all, because we are trying to convert the converts, We just have huge comfort, and then we talk, and after that we forget. But have an informal meeting to the youth. We can use our ashram facility. Don't spend so much money. Call the youth. Have a talk, heart-to-heart talk. What are the problems that you are facing? You're most welcome to talk to our students, the school, because they represent the Indonesian society. 70% are Hindus, 30% are non-Hindus. And how they are living together, what kind of challenges they have. I think it has to be more like P2P, people to people, without any interference from any agencies and anything, informal gatherings like this.
That is true. So through your audience, I would like to tell one thing, that our Vedic rituals are supposed to be the least expensive, most environment friendly, and something which can be affordable to any poorest person. If they are making money out of it, then the people in your country are not doing good to Hinduism. That one thing I would really like to criticize, because now today I have little audience from your side. So I would like to request them to somehow contain that, somehow ensure that they are not being charged so much, whether it is from wedding to cremation, any ritual, doesn't matter. Following that is more important. At times, certain rituals we don't need to invite a Brahmin. You just have to follow at home with basic ingredients like rice and kumkum or fool hai, ya fir some prashadam you have. So this is something where the essence is important to maintain, not to have those elaborated ones where you spend thousands of dollars and then you wonder whether it was worth it or not and whether you can afford or not. Because this is one of the reason people are getting away from Hinduism and our Vedic culture and Vedic Sanatan culture. So I think I want your audience to know, because maybe you can't say, but I can say this.
Thank you.
That you must cut down.
Thank you.
You must cut down. You must ensure that you are not charging. If you are a Brahmin, you are not charging so much. You have a right to earn. You have family to run, but does not mean that you dominate and allow people to get converted and go away from it. So that one request I want to make it to your audience, and I'm sure I cannot be held, against that. Why I am saying this?
Thank you.
Because I come from that land of India where we have seen that even for 500 rupees, you can get your puja done. 500 is nothing, which is maybe not even, say, $50-$60. And the same Abhishek can be done. Same Shadi ka, even for wedding rituals, not more. Many times they just charge 2,000 to 3,000 rupees, which is very small amount.
True.
So I think that culture needs to come back in your society, because otherwise, it will be difficult for poor people to follow our dharma. So thank you so much for having this wonderful conversation. I'm very pleased to talk to you, because even I learned quite a few things from you, especially about Chola dynasty, what you said. It was quite an eye-opening for me as well, that how people would take it if they are being colonized or attacked. Any last word you would like to tell our audience, please? Tell us.
I think we have to come together, and we have to come together, especially you in Kenya. Of course, more or less we are on the same boat, more or less. Of course, we are indigenous Hindus, which is a plus point, a huge plus point. And let us focus on that. Once this pandemic is over, I hope we can meet, we can get together. And some exchanges, this is very important. What I had in my mind is on a very informal way, to send some students to your place, you send some students to our place, spend a month or so, because we have a high hope on the students, those who are still, in high school or something, before they are contaminated. And then they have different aspects of Hinduism. Hindu is not just Bali, Hindu is not just India. Hindu is also in Kenya. The Westerners are practicing Hindu. These exchanges are very important.
True. Very true. That is so true. I think maybe after a pandemic is over, we can think about it.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Namaste.
Namaskar.
Namaste.